The fire was called. Before the snow came, before the cold settled deep into the bones of the valley, before the trees went silent and the birds vanished into the sky, there was a storm. A storm not like the others. It rolled in slow, with a breathless kind of thunder. Not loud, not wild, but low, patient, humming from far away like something old remembering how to wake. The people of the cave heard it from far across the trees. They had no words for seasons, but they knew the way the world softened before it hardened. The leaves were curling, the streams were quieting, and when the air grew still enough to listen to its own heartbeat, they looked up and saw the clouds stacking like sleeping mammoths across the sky. No one spoke when the first flash came. It wasn't fear, it was awe. The sky tore open white fire on gray skin. Then came the thunder, not like a drum, but like a slow rock falling. 1, 2, 3, and then silence again. Luma was the first to move. She was still small, but the silence didn't frighten her. She stepped out of the edge of the cave and looked up with wide, questioning eyes. The air tasted of iron. She licked her lips. She could smell the rain before it came. And then it did, first in dots, then in lines, then in sheets. The clan huddled under the stone shelf just outside the cave. Not deep inside, not yet. They loved to smell the rain when it came from the sky. They watched it bead on the firs and dribble down the carved grooves in the stone floor. The youngest tried to catch it on their tongues. The oldest simply sat, eyes half closed, as if remembering something distant. Then, from the forest came a crack, not thunder, not tree, something else. Smoke. One of the boys, Oric, pointed a thin trail, gray and rising from the floor of the forest like a finger beckoning. It was too far for them to see clearly, but something had been struck. The elders looked at each other, eyes speaking in silence. One of them nodded, and Luma, small, fast, brave, was chosen. They wrapped her in the waterproofed hide, tied a small bone blade to her side, and handed her a basket lined with dried moss and bark. No words, only the old woman's hand on her shoulder, a press, a blessing. And then she ran. The forest wasn't loud, not yet. The rain pattered, but the trees drank it. The roots sighed. Luma moved like a shadow, stepping where the earth was soft and skipping where it was slick. Her feet were bare. But she had walked these woods since she could walk at all. The smoke grew stronger. The light, faint and golden, flickered through the mist. She found it near the base of a lightning-struck tree. The bark was blackened and split open like a mouth, and inside the hollow, a soft glow coals, red and pulsing like the breath of something sleeping. Around it, steam rose from wet moss, curling upward into the rain. Luma crouched. The heat licked her face. Carefully, she reached into the basket, took the driest moss, and placed it near the coals. She blew, gently, like feeding a dream. The coal answered not with flame, but with a brighter red, a breath. She added bark, a wisp of smoke, another breath. Then, like it had always been waiting, a flicker, a tongue of fire. She held her breath, hands shielding it. The basket wasn't meant for carrying fire. But this fire wasn't just fire. It was the first. She coaxed it in, layered the moss, the bark, a curl of sap-covered wood. She held it close, keeping the rain off with her back. Her shoulders hunched like a shell. Then she rose slowly and ran. The fire wobbled but did not die. It stayed. Back at the cave, they had begun to hum, low, rhythmic sounds, like breathing turned to song, a song with no words. Just a sound to remind the air not to freeze. When Luma appeared at the edge of the trees, dripping, mud-streaked, The basket held out before her like an offering. They fell silent. She stepped into the mouth of the cave. The old woman stepped forward, looked inside, and smiled. They cleared a space near the center, not too close to the stone walls. A circle was drawn in ash. The basket was placed in the center. The fire, still small, still new, still unsure, was given room to breathe. One of the older men, Ruck, knelt beside it. He added a dry branch, whispered something only the fire could hear. And it grew. The circle leaned in. They warmed their fingers, not too close. They watched the way the light painted their skin orange, the way shadows danced like spirits on the wall. No one said it, but they all knew. This fire could not be allowed to die. Not tonight. Not ever. They began to plan, not with words, but with looks, gestures. The kind of shared memory that lives between people who have survived together too long to need speaking. Each night, someone would watch the fire, one person, alone, until the stars faded. Then another would take their place. The fire would have a name, not a name spoken aloud, but a place in the rhythm of breath and time. It would be fed, watched, honored. Luma was not assigned the first night. She had already given it life. That was enough. Ulrich would sit first. He was strong, quiet, still. They built a ring of stones. They laid dried wood nearby. They showed him how to coax the flame without choking it, how to watch the smoke, how to listen for the hiss of damp. Then, as darkness fell fully, and the stars blinked one by one into the ink-black sky, the others lay back in their fur-wrapped sleep, and Ulrich sat alone. The fire flickered. He did not speak. He barely moved, only added a twig when it sighed too low. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire whispered. That first night was long. Not in the way of clocks, there were none, but in the way of silence, of waiting, of trust. Ulrich sat with eyes half-lidded, arms crossed, chin resting on knees. His shadow stretched behind him, elongated by the fire's slow movement. He thought of nothing, or everything. He watched the way the flames curled like smoke, trying to remember how to be solid. He watched the coals change color from orange to blue to back again. He listened to the soft crackle, like the bones of old trees settling into sleep. At some point, a spark leapt. He did not flinch. It landed on his hand, a tiny sting, and vanished. The fire was alive, and it was learning. When the sky began to pale, not with sunrise, but with the gentler glow that came before it, he rose, quietly, slowly. He stretched his legs, his knees popped. And then, from the shadows, a new figure stepped forward. Yuma, the next watcher. They did not speak, only nodded. She sat. He stepped back, lay down, slept. Yuma leaned forward, added a sliver of root, stirred the coals with a stick. The fire responded gently, like it remembered her. She smiled. And so it began. One night, then 2, then 5, then 10. The fire never died. They fed it dry branches, peeled bark, moss that crackled, pine cones that hissed. Each item was added with care. Not out of superstition, though there was that, but out of respect. The fire was no longer a thing. It was part of them. In the quiet hours of night, the fire heard stories not spoken, thoughts unvoiced, dreams half-formed. Each person who watched it came away changed, though they could not say how. Some said the fire showed them visions in the smoke. Some said they heard footsteps from the back of the cave. Some said nothing, just sat a little longer before giving up their watch. Luma waited. Her turn would come again. She did not ask. The fire would call when it was ready. And it would call her again. The first watchers. When the fire had been alive for 10 nights, it had begun to change. It no longer flared wildly at each gust of wind, nor did it shrink in fear when the cave's shadow shifted with the moon. It had learned the rhythm of breath, of silence, of steady hands feeding it gently. It had grown into something deeper, a slow-moving heart that glowed in the center of their stone world. Those who had watched it once found themselves watching it again, not because it was their turn, but because something pulled them back, a curiosity, a comfort. The fire was no longer simply warmth. It had become a listener, a keeper of thoughts that were too soft for words. The old woman, Kura, was the first to call it the fire that hears. She spoke to no one in particular when she said it. Her voice cracked and wandered like dry leaves in the wind. But she said it with certainty, and the others listened. On the 11th night, it was Luma's turn again. She sat in the glow, just as Auric had done, legs tucked beneath her, hands resting on her knees. She was older now, though only by days. But time felt different near the fire. It moved slower, or not at all. The space between each crackle of the flame was enough to fit whole thoughts, whole memories. She didn't try to entertain herself. There was nothing to do but be with the fire. So she watched. The flames were not large. They danced gently, leaning this way and that, flickering like reeds in the wind. The coals below pulsed red and gold, breathing in and out. The smell was comforting warm bark, sweet sap, and the faint whisper of smoke. In the silence, her mind began to wander. She remembered the day she found the coal, the way the rain had cooled her skin, the way the smoke had curled into the sky like a ghost. She remembered the hush of the forest, the way the world had waited as she carried the fire home. The memory was soft. It did not demand attention, only hovered nearby, like the warmth on her cheek. Hours passed. She didn't measure them, but the fire stayed strong. When she added a new piece of wood, she whispered to it not words, but a breath, a sound she'd made up only for the fire. The flame answered with a curl, a flutter. It accepted. She smiled. As winter deepened, the fire grew more important. The nights stretched longer. The cold sank deeper. Food became sparse. And yet, no one let the fire falter. They shared the duty in silence. Some watchers stayed alert, straight-backed and solemn. Others dozed, jerking awake each time the fire gave a sigh. Some whispered stories to it, some said nothing at all. One night, a boy named To fell asleep on his watch. He was young, younger than Luma. He had begged to take a shift, to prove himself. He had sat wide-eyed, proud, determined. But sleep crept in slowly, wrapped around him like fog. When the others awoke, the fire was nearly gone, only a faint red beneath the ash. Panic bloomed like frost. Ruck moved fastest. He fell to his knees, began blowing into the coals with steady, desperate breath. Others fetched bark, moss, anything dry. Luma knelt beside him, whispering the wordless sound she'd made for the fire. It took time, but the coal flickered, then glowed, then, finally, flame returned. They didn't scold To. He was frightened enough. He sat by the wall, tears silent on his cheeks. The old woman Kura came to him. She pressed his hand into hers and said only, "The fire forgives, if you do." That night, they decided no one would watch alone anymore. Two watchers, always. And so it was. The days outside were barely more than pale hours between shadows. The sun, when it rose weakly, a cold eye peeking over the hills before sinking again. Snow fell, soft and constant. The world grew quieter. Inside, the fire hummed. It cast long shadows on the walls, Faces flickered in and out of view. The warmth was not just heat, it was a reminder that something still moved, still lived. They began to speak to the fire. Not all the time, not loudly, but here and there a thought, a memory, a name. Kura spoke of her mother, long gone, whose hands smelled of cedar. Oryx spoke of the time he found a shell with a hole through it, and the wind made it sing. Luma said nothing at first, but one night, she told the fire about her dream, the one where she stood inside the flame, and it did not burn her. It only whispered. The fire crackled in reply. They never told each other what the fire said. Maybe it said nothing. Maybe it only listened, but it was enough. One day, the snow outside rose so high it covered the cave's entrance. They had to dig through it just to breathe fresh air. The world had become a bowl of white silence. Inside, the fire flickered on, steady and calm. They no longer kept exact count of days. They marked time in embers, in the number of logs burned, in the dreams they had beside the flame. And the dreams they changed. They became longer, vivid, strange. Luma dreamed of fireflies the size of her hand, of rivers that ran uphill, of voices singing in a language she had never heard but understood perfectly. Orek dreamed of wolves who carried torches in their mouths. Kura dreamed of the sea, though she had never seen it. Each dream ended the same way with the fire, flickering gently, whispering, "Still here." One morning, Rook rose from sleep with tears on his cheeks. He was not a man who cried, but he sat before the fire, silent, eyes distant. When Luma asked what he'd seen, he only said, "My brother, in the flame." No one questioned it. They believed him. The cave itself began to feel different. The stone walls, once cold and unfeeling, seemed to lean inward, as if listening. The smoke stains that climbed toward the ceiling took on shapes: birds, hands, trees. Some swore the shadows moved on their own. One child traced a figure in the soot spiral, simple and slow. She said the fire told her to do it. No one erased it. The spiral remained. Food was always a concern, but they had prepared well. Dried roots, stored nuts, bits of meat smoked and saved. They rationed carefully. The fire was their warmth, but also their timekeeper. They ate when it told them to, slept when it yawned low, moved when it danced high. One evening, the fire burned taller than usual. No one had added extra wood. No wind stirred it. Yet it reached up, crackling with energy. Kura said, "It's remembering." They asked, "Remembering what?" She smiled, "Before us." And they sat watching. The youngest of the group, a child named Senn, began talking to the fire like a friend. He'd sit close, not too close, and tell it about his bones, about the taste of snowflakes, about his fear of owls. The fire never replied, but it never ignored him either. He gave it a name, Moo. No one stopped him. The name stuck. Knew the fire that listens. As the season wore on, the watchers changed. Luma now stayed awake easily. The fire energized her. She watched the embers curl and imagined them as tiny creatures, red-backed insects, glowing with memory. One night, during her shift, the cave grew so quiet she could hear the fire's breath. Not the sound of burning, but breath. In, out. She mimicked it. In, out. They breathed together. By now, they no longer needed to assign turns. The fire called whom it wanted. Some nights, 2 watchers. Some nights, 3. Once. Everyone stayed up, unable to sleep, lulled into silence by the crackling. They did not speak that night, just watched. A kind of communion. When the snow outside began to melt just a little, Just enough to drip. They noticed it, not because of the cold, but because the fire sighed differently. It sounded lighter, like it knew the end of something was near. But no one rushed, no one celebrated. There was sadness in the melt, a slowness in goodbye. They had lived with Mu too long, shared too much. They would not put it out. That was never the plan. The fire would decide when to sleep. Luma's dreams changed again. Now she saw green, grass, sunlight, faces in the trees. But the fire was always there, sometimes far, sometimes near. In one dream, she placed her hand into the coals and pulled out a bird made of ash. It fluttered away without a sound. She woke with her hand warm and smiled. One night, during a gentle snowfall, Senn placed a pine cone in the fire. It hissed, popped, then released a spiral of blue smoke. He clapped quietly and said it laughed. They all knew the time was coming. The world was waking. Birds called faintly in the trees. Icicles wept. The wind lost its bite. Still they watched. Still they fed the fire. But now each log added was a thank you. Not a plea, not a fear. Just a thank you. One morning, without warning, the fire burned low. No one had forgotten to feed it. No one had fallen asleep. It simply yistige, grew gentle, shrank not in pain but in peace, like a breath released. They gathered around, sat quietly. Luma held a branch, did not add it, waited. The flame looked at her, or she imagined it did, and blinked once. Then went out. Not with smoke, not with ash, just silence and warmth, still lingering. They did not speak. They sat until the coals cooled. Then Ruck collected the ash in a bowl made of stone. He scattered it outside on the snow. The first snowdrops were blooming. Mu had gone home, but not gone. Never gone. Only resting, waiting, until the fire would be called again. After the ashes, when the fire went out, it did not leave emptiness. It left quiet. A quiet so complete, it filled the cave like water in a bowl. It wrapped around the walls, curled through the stones, settled into the folds of furs and the curls of sleeping children. The warmth lingered not from heat, but from memory. The fire had ended, but its breath remained in the cave, like something sleeping nearby but unseen. For 3 days, no one lit a new flame. They still had the tools, dry moss, fire sticks, old embers tucked into bark, but they let them rest. Not from laziness, not from forgetfulness, but from something deeper reverence. Starting a new fire too soon felt like speaking over silence, like rushing the end of a song before its echo had faded. Luma wandered to the fire circle each morning, crouching where the basket had once sat, where the coals had once pulsed. The stones were still blackened. The spiral the child had traced still curled beneath the soot. She didn't sweep it away. She touched it gently, the way one might press a finger to the page of a story they didn't want to end. Senn brought offerings of feather, a shiny stone, a bit of dry bark. He placed them where the flame used to sleep. He whispered, "Mu will come back." The others did not correct him. They only nodded. Yes, it would, but not yet. Outside the cave, the world was changing. Snow still clung to the trees, but it was softening. Branches once heavy with frost, now bent, under the weight of birds returning. The streams murmured again, shy voices at first, like children re-entering a room they had been told to leave. The sky grew brighter, but not louder. The air held a new kind of breath. Ruck said the ground was waking. He could smell it. He walked farther each day, testing the forest paths, pressing his palms to the trunks of trees. "They're listening again," he said. And the trees were... Luma could feel it too. She walked behind him, sometimes alone, sometimes with Orek, sometimes just following the sound of melting snow. She saw the tracks of deer pressed into softening banks. She saw moss greening in the cracks of old stones. Life had not returned. It had waited. They understood this now. Even the fire had not truly left. It had only gone quiet. One evening, a gentle rain fell. Not a storm. Not like the one that had brought the first coal. Just a soft, steady rain, tapping on the rocks like fingers counting slowly. The people gathered inside the cave, not huddled for warmth, but for togetherness. They lit no fire, they needed none. Instead, they sang, not songs of triumph or grief, but the old kind songs without words, carried in hums and murmurs, in breath and silence. Each voice joined not to be heard, but to be felt. The cave walls drank the sound, the rain outside kept time. The spiral glowed faintly in the darkness as if warmed by memory. Senn curled beside it and slept. That night, Luma dreamed of the fire again. But it was not in the cave. It stood on a hill tall, golden, dancing without fuel, burning with no smoke. Around it stood figures, not people, not animals, not anything she could name. But they watched as she approached, not with eyes, but with presence. She stepped forward. The flame leaned toward her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The fire did not burn her. It simply touched her chest once and she woke. Her skin was cool, but her heartbeat was warm. The next morning, she walked beyond the trees. Not far, just enough. To a clearing where the moss was soft and the air smelled of pine. She knelt and dug a shallow hollow in the ground. She placed nothing inside, only touched the earth. Then, silently, she returned to the cave. She told no one. But Senn followed, and saw. In the days that followed, they began to prepare. Not for winter, but for journey. It had always been this way when the world turned warm. The people moved. The cave had been their winter home, their fire home. But spring asked them to walk again. They packed gently. They left behind stones with carvings, symbols scratched into the wall spirals, handprints, the outline of a flame. They did not speak of meanings. The fire had taught them that silence often said more than words. Luma packed the basket, the same one that had carried the first coal. Orek saw her and said nothing, but he handed her a strip of bark soaked in sap, easy to light, slow to burn. Just in case, his eyes said, just in case. On the day they left, they stood at the cave's mouth, looking back. Not with sorrow, not with urgency, only a kind of stillness, like saying thank you with their eyes. Kura, slow but steady, pressed her palm to the stone wall. Her handprint joined the others. Then they walked. The path led through woods softened by spring, ferns uncurling, moss shimmering. The air buzzed with flies, bees, wings too small to see. They moved without haste. Each step felt like breathing. Each bend in the trail held the memory of firelight. At night, they camped in small hollows, under overhangs, beside streams. They lit no great fires, only tiny ones. Enough to warm a stone, heat water, dry fur. But none burned as Mu had burned. And that was all right. Mu was not meant to be copied, only remembered. One night, a sharp wind blew. Not a storm, just the kind that reminds skin it is alive. Luma and Orek stayed awake. Not on purpose. They simply didn't sleep. The coals of the small fire they had made glowed dimly. And then, unasked, Luma said, "What if the fire comes back in a different shape?" Orek looked at her. Like what? She didn't answer. She didn't know. But the thought stayed with them. In the weeks that followed, signs began to appear. A bird with red-tipped wings flew in circles above them, then vanished. A tree, split by lightning long ago, stood hollow, but warm inside, as if it still remembered heat. A spring bubbled from stone, steam rising faintly even as the air stayed cool. Each one small, but felt. Senn pointed each out with delight. "The fire's talking," he said, and no one corrected him. Finally, they came to a valley. Wide, open, green. The kind of place where footsteps echo softly into grass, where the sky feels close and far all at once. They stopped. They did not rush to build shelters. They walked the land. Touched bark. Listened to wind. The place felt ready, like it had been waiting. They built slowly. Stone circles, shelters of bark and branch, places to sit and hear. And in the center, Luma placed the basket. Empty, but not forgotten. She did not light it. Not yet. One evening, clouds gathered. Not dark. Not angry. Just full. The wind whispered. Not warnings, but names. The people gathered. Without speaking, each one found a place around the center, where the fire had not yet been. Luma crouched near the basket. She pulled from her pouch a strip of bark, the one Orek had given her. She held it, but did not light it. Instead, she waited, and in the stillness, a single crack, not from the sky, but from the earth. A root broke, a sapling trembled, and from the basket, smoke, just a thread. Then a curl, then a flame. Small, sure, gentle. Luma did not move. The flame rose, fed itself on nothing, then leaned toward her. Like before, she whispered, not words, only a breath. And the fire answered. Mu had returned, not from the cave, not from memory, but from something deeper. The fire was not a place. It was a rhythm, a returning, a promise. The people leaned in and listened, and the flame listened back. The valley of quiet flames. The fire did not roar. It did not leap skyward or cast shadows that danced like wild beasts. It simply existed, a soft flicker in the bowl of the old basket. Just as it had once done in the cave long ago, there was no sound except the crackle of resin in the bark and the wind moving gently through the high grass of the valley. Luma sat close to it, not too near to disturb its breath, but near enough that she could see its light glint in her eyelashes. It had returned without command, without ritual. It had chosen the moment, and now it was theirs again. But this fire was not the same as the one in the cave. It was gentler, somehow. More knowing, less afraid. And though no one said so aloud, they all understood they had changed, too. The people moved slowly in the valley, careful not to step too heavily where they didn't yet belong. They listened to the grass, which whispered in long waves when the wind curled across it. They watched the sun move differently here. The mornings came with thin, golden light that shimmered like wet stone, and the evenings faded not into black, but into a soft gray that hummed. The fire lived in the center of their camp now, not because they placed it there, but because that is where it had wanted to be. There was no need for watch shifts anymore. The fire did not need guarding. It kept itself. Instead, they took turns sitting with it companionship rather than duty. Some told it stories from their dreams, others asked it questions, and smiled at the silence that followed. No answers came, but none were expected. Senn, now a little taller, liked to bring it pebbles he found near the stream. Some were round, others speckled, one even shaped like a fish. He would set them beside the fire, then wait to see if the flame flickered in approval. It often did. One evening, he asked it, "Do you remember the caves?" The fire answered with a gentle pop. And Senn nodded, satisfied. Kura had begun marking stones, not for ritual, not for worship, but because the fire had stirred something in her memory. She pressed ash into grooves she carved with the point of a bone. Spirals, yes, but also lines, dots, clusters, patterns that felt familiar without having been seen before. When asked what they meant, she only shrugged and said, "They're for remembering." Remembering what? She smiled and whispered, "The things we forgot before we were born." Orek helped her sometimes, steadying the larger stones while she worked. He said little, but he watched carefully, as if every stroke of her hand held something he needed to understand. The valley became home, slowly, like a leaf unfolding over weeks. They built no walls, only lean-tos, low to the ground, shaped to hug the earth. They used bark, branches, dried grass. Rain passed through easily, but it didn't bother them. The land was kind here. The wind that carried clouds also carried scents: sage, pine, wet stone, and once, even the faint trace of smoke from beyond the ridge. They followed it one morning, not with urgency, but with curiosity. What they found was another fire, but not theirs. Another group of people had made camp at the edge of a dry riverbed. Their fire was large, their stones blackened. They looked up with surprise, but no fear. There were nods. Eyes met. Then silence. Luma stepped forward and opened her palm to show the spiral, etched into her skin with soot. One of the strangers, a woman with hair like silver straw, knelt and traced a matching spiral into the dust. And that was enough. They stayed the night, each group beside its own fire. Stories were shared not through language, but through gesture, expression, humming. A boy showed Senn how to balance a flat stone on a reed. Kura traded a small bone comb for a length of dried seaweed. The fire crackled between them, like an old friend pleased to see long-lost siblings reunited. In the morning, the strangers were gone. Only the spiral in the dust remained, and an ember left gently at the edge of the trail. A gift, or a reminder. Time passed, but no one counted it. They measured instead in changes. The first bird call of the season, the sprouting of wild garlic near the stream. The day the sun stayed above the ridge past the hour of soup. Orek found a place where mushrooms grew in perfect circles. Senn named them moonteeth. He never picked them, just visited, as if they were cousins. They slept soundly, dreamed deeply. And in those dreams, the fire often appeared not just Mu, but others. Fires that walked, that sang, that flew through the trees like bright birds. Fires that whispered and laughed and watched. Luma dreamed of a river of flame, not dangerous, but comforting. It carried her like a cradle and sang without words. She woke with the smell of smoke in her hair. There had been no fire that night. None that they lit, anyway. One morning, Kura did not rise. She had not been sick. She had not been tired. She had simply finished. She lay beneath her woven blanket, hands folded, eyes closed. Beside her, someone had placed a small stone, blackened, spiral-marked. No one wept loudly. No one rushed. Instead, they built a ring of stones around her resting place, and beside it, they lit a small fire. Not to burn her, only to remember. They called it the Keeper's Flame. It burned for 3 days, then let itself go out. Just like Kura had. And when the smoke faded, the stone in the center glowed faintly. It still glows. That spring, they moved deeper into the valley. Not far, just enough. They found a hill that looked like it had once been the back of a sleeping giant. Soft curves, patches of moss, stones like vertebrae. At the top, they placed no fire. Only sat, watched, waited. And from below, the valley spoke back. Birds, bees, wind through reeds. And that faint, familiar whisper. Still here. Still warm. Still waiting. They carried the basket with them, though it was mostly empty now. Except for a handful of ash. Luma sometimes dipped her fingers in and traced spirals on stones, on skin, on tree bark. Not to mark, just to remember. Orek found her one evening, spiraling soot on the side of a young birch. He asked, "Will we stay here forever?" She shook her head. "No, but the fire might—" He nodded. That made sense. The fire changed, as it always had. Sometimes it flickered blue, other times orange like the belly of a fox. Once, it burned green for 3 breaths, then laughed itself back to red. Senn declared it was telling jokes. No one argued. They began to let the fire decide when to burn. Some nights it lit itself. Other nights it slept. They never asked why. It wasn't that kind of relationship. New children were born. Their names carried sounds like wind, like stone, like the sound fire makes when it finds pine resin. They were taught to listen before they asked questions, to watch before they moved, and always, always to breathe near the fire before feeding it, to greet it as they would an elder, not with words, but with respect. One evening, the fire rose high, higher than it ever had, but not in anger, in joy. The people gathered without being called. They stood in a wide circle, holding nothing, wearing only what the wind had not taken from their hair. Luma stepped forward. In her hands, a branch carved long ago by Kura. She placed it in the fire. It did not burn. It glowed. And then, like breath, it vanished. The fire sighed, and the stars answered, one by one, flickering to life above. The valley slept. The fire dreamed. And the people listened, for they had learned, at last, the flame was not theirs. They were its, the language of ember and earth. The days moved gently in the valley, each one folding into the next like the soft layering of furs before sleep. There were no loud mornings, no sudden nights. Time in the valley was a hush, a gentle pulse that guided the people from one breath to the next, one season into another, without ever asking them to hurry. The fire in the center of their gathering had grown wiser. It no longer danced wildly or crackled to call attention. Instead, it glowed steadily. A soft and constant reminder that not everything must change to stay alive. The flame had settled into something like a rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat or the swell and retreat of breath. Even in stillness, it spoke. It did not need voice. Its light was language enough. Luma woke one morning with ash on her fingertips. She did not remember dipping them into the remains of last night's fire. And yet, there it was, a soft gray dust in the grooves of her skin, a whisper of memory where memory had not been invited. She pressed her thumb to the bark of a nearby tree and left a faint spiral. She smiled. The fire had been speaking again, or perhaps she had been listening in her sleep. Either way, the message was clear: keep remembering. The children had begun naming things the older ones had no words for. A certain shape of cloud became float feather. A specific wind that passed through the hollowed bones of trees was called deep whistle. The sound of rain striking warm stones was hush spark. They were not taught these words, the valley gave them freely, and the children accepted them without question. The adults did not correct. There was nothing to correct. The fire, too, accepted the new words. Sometimes it flared when float feather was said. Sometimes it grew suddenly quiet when someone whispered deep whistle. Language had become something shared between flame, forest, and breath. And the fire was always listening. Orek had taken to walking beyond the valley's edge. Not far, only as far as he could still see the thin column of smoke that curled from their camp like a silver hair caught in sunlight. He called it speaking with the edges. Each day, he brought back something a stone with an unusual warmth. A clump of moss that shimmered even in shade. A feather that smelled faintly of wood smoke. None of it was remarkable on its own, but each offering was laid beside the fire as though it belonged. The fire accepted all. It never flared in rejection. Once, Auric brought back a small bone, polished smooth by time and perhaps water. When he placed it near the basket that still held the oldest embers, the flame bent toward it just slightly, just enough. That night, he dreamed of rivers that burned instead of flowed, and banks of ash that bloomed with red flowers when stepped upon. He told Luma the next morning, and she only nodded. "It's listening," she said. He didn't ask what it meant. He already knew. Senn had begun singing to the fire. The songs had no words, only tones and breath and rhythm, made up in the moment. At first, he did it while playing alone, sitting cross-legged with a stick in his hand and drawing circles in the dirt. But soon, he found the songs form themselves, only when he was near the flame. It listened, he thought, not just with sound, but with heat. The fire responded with flickers, with pulses, with slow, crackling sounds that matched the rhythm of his breath. He started calling them ember lullabies. Others began to join him, not always with voice, but with drumming fingers on stones, with feet tapping moss, with the gentle swish of grass brushed by palm. Together, they made what Luma would one day call the first music, a harmony, not of melody, but of intention. A song that belonged to no one, but was shared by all. And the fire kept perfect time. The spiral, too, had changed. It appeared in more places now, not just scratched into stone or pressed into bark, but found in the curl of river reeds, the growth of vines, the flight of birds circling above their camp. Some believed the fire was shaping the world in its image. Others believed the world had always been shaped that way, and the fire merely helped them see it. Either way, they began marking the spiral not as a symbol of flame alone, but of connection. Kura's old stones, carefully protected in a ring near the camp, were now visited like elders. New spirals were added beside her original ones, smaller, rougher, but still earnest, no one defaced, no one erased. Memory, they had learned, was not something to be edited. It was something to be added to, layer upon layer, like the rings of a tree, the coiling of smoke, the winding of the spiral itself. Seasons turned, as they always had. The valley grew warmer, then wet, then briefly angry with storms that passed like fast-tempered spirits. They watched lightning split trees, then grow silent again. They watched rivers flood and then fall asleep. And through it all, the fire remained. They had stopped calling it by name. New had become something too vast for words. The fire was not one thing, but many. And so it was simply the flame. A word spoken with softness, not reverence, like a friend's name murmured in a dream. Luma had begun carving again. Not spirals, but stories. She used a bone needle to etch tiny scenes into the long stones that lay along the camp's edge. A circle of people with a flame in the center. A sleeping cave with smoke curling from its mouth. A river with glowing embers in its current. A single figure holding a basket of light. She never explained what they meant. She didn't need to. Each person who saw them understood in their own way. The fire never looked at the carvings, but Luma suspected it already knew them by heart. Then one day, something changed. The fire went out. Not with drama, not with wind, not with water. It simply stopped. One moment it was there, a steady breath of warmth and light. The next, it was smoke, then scent. Then nothing. The people did not panic. They sat. They waited. They listened. Senn reached out a hand to the still warm stones and said, "It's not gone." And no one disagreed. For 3 days they lit no flame. They let the silence settle. They let the absence speak. The basket sat in the center, empty once more. Or perhaps full. It was hard to tell the difference now. On the 4th day, the fire returned. It did not need to be called. It appeared quietly, softly, a single red spark in the bottom of the basket, glowing like a heartbeat in deep sleep. No one touched it. No one breathed too loud. The fire had remembered itself. And the people did, too. That night, Senn dreamed of stars falling from the sky. Not as omens, but as seeds. Each one struck the earth and sank. And from the places they landed, tiny fires grew, not wild, not dangerous, but warm and slow and alive. In his dream, he walked among them. They whispered his name. And when he woke, the spiral on his wrist, one he'd drawn in soot weeks before, was still there, unfaded. The valley stayed quiet, not from stillness, but from knowing. Every breeze carried stories now. Every shadow held memory. Every spark was a letter in a language they were just beginning to learn. And the fire was their teacher. Patient, endless, kind. When the fire dreamed of water, the fire had always known its shape, soft and round, flickering and breathing like an animal curled in sleep. But on the day the sky opened and the rain came down in long, slow curtains, the fire changed. Not in anger, not in fear, but in reflection. For the first time in many seasons, the flame dreamed of water. It was a strange dream, quiet and long, a dream made not of light, but of ripples. And those who sat near the fire that day felt it not with their eyes, but in their bones, like the hush of mist on moss or the cool of wet bark pressed to cheek. Luma was the first to notice. She sat with the flame in silence, her eyes half closed, hands resting in her lap, palms up, around her. The rain made music, not the sharp, urgent kind, but a patient, steady rhythm like old footsteps on damp stone. The fire didn't hiss or recoil. It leaned into the wetness. It seemed to listen. Luma whispered, "You remember, don't you?" And the flame flickered, once, slowly, like a nod. That night, they told the children the story of the time before flame. Not to scare them, but to remind them that even warmth has a beginning. Senn was the one to speak, his voice now deeper with seasons, but still gentle like the wind that rustled leafless trees. Before the fire came, we only had cold, he said, but it wasn't cruel, just quiet, like the dark before dreams. The children listened, wide-eyed, nestled in fur and moss. The fire beside them pulsed with each breath, not brightly, but steadily. And when the first flame came, Senn continued. It didn't shout, it whispered. He paused. The fire crackled. And in that whisper was everything: stories, warmth, memory, and the promise that even in the deepest winter, something would always remember the shape of light. The children didn't ask questions. They only smiled, because they already knew. In the days that followed the rain, the valley shimmered. Drops clung to every branch, every blade of grass, every hair on every beast's back. The world was wet. Yes, but not heavy. It was alive, and in the middle of it all, the fire still burned, gently and brightly. Orek began walking further during these days, not because he was restless, but because the land seemed to be singing, and he wanted to hear the verses hidden beyond the hills. He followed bird paths. He traced the edges of streams that hadn't existed before the rain. He watched insects move like dancers across water. And everywhere he went, he left small spirals pressed into mud, etched with sticks, drawn with wet fingers on rocks. He wasn't leaving a trail. He was saying thank you. One morning, Luma awoke with a dream still clinging to her breath. She had seen a place of red stone, shaped like a bowl. In its center, there was no fire, only stillness, and a single spark floating in the air like a seed. The dream had felt real, like a memory, but older than her own. She told no one for 3 days. Then, on the 4th, she stood before the flame and said aloud, "I want to find it." No one stopped her. No one asked why. Instead, Orek placed a warm stone in her palm and said, "For remembering." Senn gave her a pouch of ash, not for lighting, but for marking. And the children, one by one, each placed a small feather in her basket, not from birds, but ones they had made twisted reeds, curled leaves, soft bark, symbols of flight, of return. Luma smiled. Then she walked. The journey was slow, not because the land was rough, though at times it was, but because she was not in a hurry. She stopped often, to listen, to taste the air, to place her palm on the trunks of trees and feel their stories in the grooves of bark. She moved like smoke, never straight, never forceful. And always the fire burned in her mind, not as an image, but as a presence. At night she did not light flame. She watched stars instead. And when the cold crept in, she whispered old songs. Sometimes, she thought she heard them answered. By what, she never knew. On the 12th day, she found the bowl of red stone. It was exactly as in her dream. Wide and shallow, smoothed by time and wind, with a center so flat it could have been carved by thought. She stepped into it slowly. In the middle, she stood still. There was no spark this time. Only silence. But it was not empty. It was listening. So she spoke. Not with words, but with her body. She placed the ash on her palms and pressed them to stone. She traced spirals with her feet. She sat. She waited. And in time, warmth came not to her skin, but to her breath. A memory. A flame. Of family. Of the promise made long ago when the first fire was born to never forget the light. When she returned to the valley, no one asked what she had seen. They didn't need to. She carried the answer in her eyes. And the fire, upon seeing her, rose slightly, just enough to acknowledge. Not with pride, but with recognition. "You remember," it said. And she nodded. Yes. From then on, the valley was quieter. Not in sound, but in energy, as if even the wind had grown thoughtful. The people began making circles of their own, not just spirals, but rings of stone, moss, carved wood, silent places where they could sit and speak without speaking. They called them listening grounds. No one claimed them. They were not sacred, just helpful. Senn built one near the stream, where frogs sang even in the cold. Orek placed one on a hill, where the wind kissed the back of his neck in the mornings. The children made one under a fallen tree, where light filtered through broken bark like drifting stars. And the fire approved. It did not grow. It did not shrink. It simply glowed. Content. That winter snow came like a whisper, soft and even, not as a threat but as a blanket. The fire was not fed more than usual. It didn't need to be. The people had learned by now the fire did not measure strength by size. It measured by presence, by intention, by care. Even in the snow it burned. Even in the wind it listened. Even in silence it spoke. And when the nights were longest, and the valley slept beneath a white sky, the fire dreamed again. This time of roots, of stone, of the first shadow cast by flame, reaching not away but inward, toward memory, toward meaning, toward home. The quiet beneath the flame. The snow had not stopped in days, and yet it never came with anger. It floated instead, soft as breath, slow as thought. The valley did not resist the cold, nor did it fear the snow. It accepted the season, as it had accepted all others, with a kind of quiet wisdom known only to rivers, to trees, and to fires that remembered. The fire burned on. Its shape was smaller now, tighter, like a curled animal at rest. But it was not dying. It was conserving, waiting, dreaming perhaps. Those who tended it did so with the same patience. It taught, not hurried, not worried, simply present. Luma sat beside it most mornings, a fur shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hands resting in her lap like fallen leaves. She did not speak to the flame anymore, not aloud, but her breath matched its rhythm: inhale, flicker, exhale, glow. There was no need for words. The fire knew. Far from the camp, in a hollow where the snow gathered thickest, Orek had begun building something. He did not call it a shelter, though it might have looked like one. He did not call it a shrine, though it carried the care of one. It was a circle of packed snow, chest high, open to the sky. Inside it, he placed a single flat stone, and on it, a small pile of ashes, not from the fire in the valley, but from burned bark he had found elsewhere, wood struck by lightning, left black and brittle. Each day he visited this place. Each day he said nothing. Each day the snow whispered against the ash, and the wind carried away the finer dust. He did not rebuild what disappeared. He let it fade. That, too, was part of the work. Senn had grown quiet, not in sadness, not in withdrawal, but in study. He spent most of his time now listening to the creak of trees beneath snow, to the slow shift of ice across stone, to the way the wind moved through the hair of sleeping beasts. He kept a pouch of seeds on his belt, not to plant, but to feel, round, hard, waiting things, full of spring, even now. He often sat with the children, not to teach, but to learn. They would tell him the names of things he had forgotten, the way snowflakes changed shape in different corners of the camp, how the cold air smelled sweeter in the morning than at night, how the fire's light cast two shadows instead of one when you sang beside it. He nodded at their truths, and added none of his own. Some knowledge did not need collecting. It needed honoring. One evening, when the stars were sharp and unmoving above, Luma lit a second fire, not far from the first, but distinct, its own shape, its own light. No one questioned her. They simply watched. She placed no wood at its center. Instead, she surrounded it with memories the stones Kura had once marked. Feathers from the children's baskets, a handful of moss from Orek's hill, and the pouch of seeds Senn had given her. Then she waited, and the fire grew not in height, not in heat, but in color. It flickered a little bluer, a little softer, like dusk caught in flame. When Luma spoke, her voice was not loud. It was not meant to be. "This fire is not for warmth," she said. "It is for returning." And the others understood. The next morning they found footprints in the snow. Small, unfamiliar, not made by animal or child. They led from the edge of the forest to the second fire, circled it once, then vanished. No one followed them. No one erased them. They let the snow decide how long they should remain. That night, Senn sang beside the returning fire. His voice was a hum, low and steady, rising only when the wind did. The fire hummed back, and something in the valley shifted, not seen, but sensed. A new kind of stillness, a deeper one, like the hush that comes just before a dream begins. Luma began weaving stories into the fabric of their clothes, not with words, but with color ochre for memory, soot for silence, blue from frozen berries for questions, green from old moss for promises. Each thread told something. Each piece of clothing became a page in a book that was never written, but always read. The children began to trade tunics, not because they outgrew them, but because they wished to carry someone else's story for a while. Even the fire, they said, read them. Sometimes it flared when a new color approached. Sometimes it dimmed. Sometimes it simply glowed content to listen. The old spiral, once drawn on stones and carved into bark, now appeared in footsteps, in the paths people took to gather water, in the way they circled the fires before sleeping, in the trails worn through snow between shelters. It was no longer a symbol they made. It was a pattern they lived, a slow return, a steady remembering. Then came the night when the fire stilled, not died, not faded, simply hobe. No flicker, no crackle, no breath. Those who saw it did not panic. They sat. They waited. The stillness lasted only moments, but in those moments, everything listened. Even the stars. Then the flame blinked, like an eye waking from a long dream, and burned again. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. The fire had gone somewhere, and come back. Senn was the first to speak the next morning. His words were simple. "I think it's learning." Luma nodded. "I think we are, too." The valley remained. The snow stayed, then melted, then came again. Seasons turned not as cycles, but as echoes, each one familiar, each one new. The fire remained. It no longer needed tending. It needed remembering. And the people, those who walked in spirals, who wore stories on their sleeves, who sang to the silence and listened to snow, they remembered. Not because they had to, but because it was how they lived. The fire, in return, kept burning. Not with hunger, not with pride, but with presence. And when the wind howled through the valley, and the stars blinked low in the cold sky, the fire did not flinch. It only glowed, like a thought too ancient to name, like a promise too old to be spoken, like the breath of the world, steady and warm, whispering, "Still here, still here." The song of the old smoke. The wind returned first, not as a storm or howl, but as a memory. It slipped through the branches, around stones, beneath the wooden slats of the shelters, and over the curved backs of those who knelt to tend small things. It brought with it the scent of smoke, not fresh, but old, an echo of fires long cooled. No one questioned where it came from. They simply let it pass. And when it lingered, curling around the ankles of children who played near the ash rings, they greeted it as one might greet an old relative, not with surprise, but with quiet recognition. "The old smoke is back," said Senn one morning, lifting his eyes to the gray streak drifting along the ridge. Luma touched her shoulder, where a scrap of moss-colored cloth fluttered from her cloak. "It's following something." Orek, who had been silent that morning, only nodded. He did not speak often now, but when he did, his words felt heavier, more settled, as if formed not in his mouth but in the stones beneath his feet. In the heart of the valley, the main fire remained unchanged. It no longer flared. It no longer danced. It simply existed. Some days, it barely flickered, but no one feared its stillness. They had come to understand that the fire's brightness did not measure its strength. Rather, it was in its listening, in the way it absorbed every glance, every footstep, every sigh. It had become a witness, more than a warmth. One evening, as the sun bled gently into the snow-covered hills, a group gathered around the second fire, the one Luma had built, the one they called the returning flame. They sat without speaking. Children curled beside sleeping adults. Furs were pulled tighter, not from cold but from quiet. And when the wind rose again, threading its way through their circle, the fire did something it had never done before. It hummed, softly, low and even, like the vibration of a stone when pressed to the earth. It was not a sound anyone had heard from flame before, yet no one doubted it. It was a song. The old ones said the fire had learned from the smoke. Long ago, they said. Smoke had been the fire's first thought. Before light, before warmth, before even memory. Smoke had risen into the sky like a question. It had carried the scent of wood, of moss, of stone, of those who watched. And now, perhaps, it had returned to answer. So they began watching the smoke more closely. Not to trap it, not to study it, but to feel what it remembered. Some days it carried the scent of berries, other days of salt, though no sea had touched the valley in many lifetimes. And sometimes it smelled of nothing at all but still left something behind, a mood, a pause, a thought not yet spoken. The children began making smoke catchers, not like nets, not like jars, but shapes woven from long reeds, curved bone, and dried leaves. They hung them from low branches or placed them in the hollows of trees. They believed that when the smoke passed through these shapes, it might leave behind pieces of its dreams. And perhaps it did. For when Senn passed beneath one such catcher, he heard a sound like breath caught between two branches. A soft exhale. A thank you. As the nights lengthened and the air grew thick with hush, the people changed their stories. They no longer spoke of beginnings or endings. They spoke of middles, of the moments between footfalls, of the silence between breaths, of the warmth between two shared furs. They told stories that had no conflict, no turning, no lesson, only movement, only presence. The children, wrapped in moss and wool, called them drift stories. Because they didn't listen to them with their ears, they drifted into them. And when they woke, they did not remember details. Only peace. One morning, a child named Yori awoke before the rest. She was small, quiet, and often unnoticed, something she liked. She walked out of the shelter and down the path where frost kissed every stone, and where her breath made little clouds that rose and fell like birds. She walked not with a goal, but with a rhythm. Step, look, listen. She came to the place where Auric had built his circle of snow long ago. The circle was half melted now, its edges crumbling, the ash stone inside buried under days of drift. She sat. She said nothing. And after a while she heard it, the smoke singing again. But this time not a hum, a phrase, one word, one old word, not in any language she had been taught. But she understood. Still. That evening she told the fire, not with speech, but by placing her hand over her heart, and then touching the ashes in the main ring. The fire glowed slightly, not brighter, just deeper, as if it too knew that word, as if it too had waited to hear it spoken. That night, Luma spoke again, not as leader, not as weaver, but as listener. We do not light the fire, she said softly. We remind it that it already burns. And everyone nodded, because it was true. The fire did not begin with spark. It began with need, with care, with memory. And when it flickered in the night, it did not ask for more wood. It asked to be noticed, to be known, to be remembered. So they did. They began lighting smaller fires, not to warm their hands, but to trace their thoughts. They lit them beside streams and hollow trees, near animal dens, beneath overhangs where old bones slept. They watched what the fire remembered in each place. Some burned bright and quick, like a greeting. Some burned low and long, like a goodbye. Some refused to light at all, not from dampness, but from disinterest. And the people understood. Not every place needed remembering. Some things had already been returned. Senn began building a spiral again. This one larger, but softer. Made not of stone, but of footprints in snow. He walked the path each morning, always alone, always in silence. He did not invite others. He did not forbid them. He simply walked. And when his spiral finally closed itself one dawn, he stood in the center and whispered, "There." No one asked what he meant. But the fire that night hummed again, and the smoke drifted lower, so we're more certain. They say the flame grew old that year. Not weaker, not faded, just old, like trees that no longer reach upward, but instead grow rings inward. The fire's shape changed. Its center held stillness. Its edges held memory. Its breath held time. And when the wind passed through, it no longer moved the flame. The flame moved the wind. In the final snowfall of that season, the people gathered in silence. They brought nothing. They said nothing. They simply stood in the snow, facing the fire. Even the animals came. The birds quieted. The insects held still. And the fire burned not for them, not for itself, but for the moment. A moment with no purpose, no story, only presence. The snow fell. The fire glowed. And something deep beneath the valley, beneath stone, beneath root, beneath thought exhaled. The breathing stone. The sky above the valley grew pale with a kind of still light that did not seem to come from the sun, but from the snow itself. It had been days, perhaps weeks, since the last true sunrise. But no one counted anymore. Time was measured now in breaths beside the fire, in the slow melting of icicles, and in the number of footsteps it took to walk the spiral path Senn traced each morning. The fire remained. Not just one, now, but many. Small, quiet fires that had sprung up like moss along the edges of the valley, each with its own memory, its own tone. They were not meant to replace the first fire, nor even to mimic it. They were simply echoes, soft, reverent echoes of something older than language. The people moved among them not like keepers, but like companions. Each fire had its own watcher, and the watcher changed as the day did. There were no assignments, only feelings. When it was time, one simply sat. And the fire accepted. Luma sat with one such fire on a morning when the frost curled upward from the earth like fingers. She had brought no offering, no story, not even a thought. She only breathed. The fire flickered slightly at her presence, and she imagined it was greeting her not with warmth, but with recognition. Nearby, a child named Kael was stacking stones. He did not know why, only that he liked how the cold of the stone met the warmth of his palms. He arranged them in circles, then spirals, then stacks that leaned gently against one another like sleeping figures. Senn watched him from a distance. He saw the pattern, though he said nothing. Some knowledge he had learned was not to be taught, only witnessed. That night, Kael placed a single stone at the base of the first fire. It was smooth and dark and hummed faintly when warmed. No one had told him to do it. No one questioned why. The fire did not change. But in the morning, when Luma stirred the ashes, she found that the stone had cracked, not broken, not shattered, just split, like a fruit ready to open. Inside was not more stone, but warmth. Soft, slow, like breath. They began to call it the breathing stone. Over time, each fire was given one, a stone not chosen, but found by children, by elders, by those who dreamed beside the flames. When placed at the center of the fire, each stone responded in its own way. Some glowed faintly, others sang not with sound, but with a pull, a kind of gravity of feeling that drew the listener into stillness. Senn said quietly one evening, "These stones are not tools, they are memories." Orek, who rarely spoke now, simply nodded, and the valley listened. The wind had changed again. It came now from beneath the earth, not above. The people could feel it in their feet, in their teeth, in the way the fire sometimes flared low even without wood. They began sleeping closer to the ground, not out of fear, but to hear better. They said the earth was dreaming again, that in its deep sleep it remembered fire, and that it shared those dreams in warmth. One day, Kael wandered beyond the edge of the valley, following the path of an old fox. The snow was deep but soft, like flour, and it did not resist him. He found a stone half buried in a drift, shaped like a teardrop, and when he touched it, it hummed not to him, but to the fire waiting far away. He carried it back in silence, and when he placed it in the center of a fire near the river, the flames rose high, then still. And then the water steamed. A thin mist curled upward from the ice, and in it, shapes danced, not people, not animals, but ideas, not to be interpreted, only felt. The others gathered, but no one spoke. The fire was telling a story. One older than the valley, older than winter, older than flame, and all it asked was that they listen. Luma, in her dreams, began to hear footsteps. Not near, not far, just approaching. When she woke, she found her hands already holding stones she had not gathered. Her cloak smelled faintly of ash and moss, and the tips of her hair glowed slightly in the dark. She said nothing of it. Some changes did not need speaking. They needed welcoming. That season, no new fires were lit. Not because they were forbidden, but because none were needed. The fire, it seemed, had begun moving on its own. Not across the land, but within. Within stone, within breath, within story. And when a child sat in silence, the fire sat with them. And when an elder closed their eyes, the fire blinked, too. And when the snow fell, it did not smother. It softened, as if it too had learned from the fire. Not how to burn, but how to be. The breathing stone at the first fire split again. This time, a small flame emerged. No smoke, no heat, only light. It hovered for a moment, then drifted upward, caught on a breeze no one else felt. And as it vanished into the night, Luma whispered, "It remembers." And Oric replied, "For the first time in weeks. So must we." When stones remember, the valley no longer felt cold, though the snow still lay thick on the hillsides and icicles clung to branches like ornaments of stillness. It was not that winter had ended, it had not. The cold remained, but something beneath it had shifted. The people no longer moved in resistance to the cold, nor in fear of it. Instead, they moved with it, as if their breath and the frost were following the same rhythm. Children no longer asked when the warm seasons would return. They simply grew used to the language of the snow, the hush of its fall, the crackle beneath their boots, the fine mist of their breath against its silence. And when they gathered near the fires, they did not huddle as before. They sat openly, palms exposed to the flickering light, as if sharing more than warmth. The breathing stones had become a part of the valley's rhythm. Each stone held a silence that pulsed, like the chest of something sleeping deeply, dreaming not of movement, but of memory. They were placed now not only in fires, but in shelters, in satchels, beneath pillows, beside the beds of those who were sick or near passing. Their warmth did not burn. It lingered. One elder, who had not spoken for many days, finally opened her mouth by the river. She held a breathing stone in both hands, pressed to her chest, and said, "This one remembers my mother." No one questioned it. Some stones held names. Others held sounds. One, it was said, held the feeling of standing beneath a thunderstorm. Another gave the scent of bear fur warmed by sun. They were not tools. They were echoes. And sometimes, When no one was touching them, they pulsed in time with the heartbeat of the valley itself. The first fire had changed again. It was no longer contained in a pit or ring. It had spread not as a blaze, but as a presence. People saw it in the breath of sleeping dogs, in the glint of icicles just before they melted, in the steam that rose from snow warmed by sun. It was not only fire now, it was the idea of fire. And that idea lived everywhere, even in stone. One child, a quiet girl named Aya, began to sleep beside the stone circle that Senn had long tended. The spiral, now nearly erased by snowfall and time, had become more suggestion than structure. But each morning, Aya walked it, not to remember its shape, but to feel its center. She began placing smaller stones at each bend, not to mark direction, but to hold silence. And one morning the spiral began to hum. No one else heard it at first. Only Aya. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was the sound of something being remembered. When Senn walked the spiral that day, he stopped at its center, stood still, and said, very softly, "She hears what I once hoped to hear." No one replied. They didn't need to. The spiral did. That evening, Luma gathered the people not around the first fire, because it no longer lived in one place, but around a quiet ring of stones in the center of the valley. There was no flame, no smoke, only stones placed by different hands at different times. She said, "We are no longer keeping the fire." She paused. "The fire is keeping us." They began to tell stories in the dark again. Not to teach, not to warn, just to share. And not all stories had fire in them. Some were about water, some about snow, some about walking until the land forgot your name and gave you a new one. They told them slowly, with long silences between words, like breaths. And sometimes, when no one was speaking, they could hear the stones answering not with language, but with feeling. One morning, Orek did not rise. He lay beneath his furs, eyes closed, lips parted just slightly, as if preparing to say one last word. Beside him, the breathing stone he had kept all season pulsed faintly. Not fast, not urgent, just steady. Luma knelt beside him. She did not cry. She placed her hand over his, and the fire within the stone grew warm. Orek opened his eyes, looked once at the sky beyond the shelter wall, and smiled. Then he was gone, but the warmth remained, and no one felt cold. Not that day, not that night, not ever again in quite the same way. Time moved differently after that. The people no longer marked it by sun or moon. They marked it by the soft return of breath in silence, by the quiet fire inside each stone, by the stories whispered between those who no longer needed to speak loudly. They understood now. That fire was not something made, it was something found, and sometimes it was something remembered. One day, Kael stood on the edge of the valley. He held a stone in his hand. It was warm, though there was no fire near. He looked at the distant trees, the snow beyond, and the path no one had walked since the first frost. He did not ask for permission. He simply walked. And where he stepped, the snow seemed softer, the sky a little lighter, and the air almost listening. He would carry the memory of fire to places it had never reached. And when he found another valley, or another child, or even only himself in need of remembering, he would sit and breathe and wait. Because fire, he had learned, always returns to those who make space for it, even in silence, even in stone, even in sleep. And so the story ends, not with a flame, not with a spark, not even with a word, but with a stone, warm, breathing, remembering, still.